Hello. So, H.G. Wells, um, famous author, wrote almost a book a year from 1895 to 1941. A lot of these were actually written in serial form, published in magazines, and then compiled into books when they were done. That's the way people did things back then, often. Known for his science fiction. A lot of what he wrote, he was like the first person to do it, or some of it was actually like predictive. So I'm just going to go through some of what he gave the world in terms of science fiction and or futuristic writings. Not everything he did was science fiction. He wrote some romances, he wrote some adventures, but he's probably best known for his science fiction. Went through a list of his books. Didn't go through all his short stories because he also wrote short stories while he was writing books. But I haven't read all of these, but I read synopses of some of them. So some of them I did read, which is what got me on this as a subject. So his or earliest book was The Time Machine, written in 1895. Now, philosophers had spoken of the nature of time before that, and modern, analysts have argued, was this the first time travel story? And I think it was. Like I said, philosophers had talked about time. None of them had really considered the possibility of traveling through time that I know of. Time Machine is sort of the first example I can find of anywhere where someone decided let's create a machine which allows someone to travel in time. Um, we could always argue prophecy, the ability to see the future, but again, that's more a visual thing. That's not an actual going there. The time machine worked for two reasons. One, when he went to the past, he didn't try to interact with anything, he just basically observed. And two, when he went to the future, he went so far into the future that he couldn't really tell what caused it. So he didn't wasn't able to go back in time and try to change it. Or I guess he could have with the machine tried to figure it out and could have tried to stop it all from happening, but that would have taken time. Um, One of the reasons why the book did better than most of the movies made after it was that he didn't try to interact with it. It was a new concept, so he was able to write it. This is a theoretical what happens if someone could travel through time, as opposed to we got 90 minutes to get this good action movie going. So, like I said, I think the book did better than most of the movies supposedly based on the book, just because H.G. Wells didn't actually have his characters interact with things as much as the movies did. The movies you almost have to, otherwise it's watching some guy watch history, which would be sort of boring. 1897, he wrote a short story called The Crystal Egg. Some people think this was the forerunner to War of the Worlds. A man finds a small crystal egg shaped object which, when he looks into it, he can see an alien planet. Um, and so some people say that these eggs, apparently the people on the planet had these eggs too. So some people say this is how that the Martians found out about Earth and invaded. Um, I don't think that was Wells' intended at any point. In fact, his description of the alien world was a lot different than his description of the War of the World aliens. No reason to believe it was Mars. But what I like about this story was this was like the first we are having an outside observer looking at an alien world, and so it's not we've had myths and fairy tales and stuff where we had fairyland and strange cultures, and in those the narrator basically tells you a little bit about it. It's, these are the trolls, and they do this, and this is why we worry about them, and all the troll knowledge you would need to understand what trolls are like. Whereas in this case, it was the guy's making observations, and he's narrating to a friend about him, and so, or he tells a friend about the egg he found, and apparently his friend tries to use it and can't. So this is an interesting point. Is we, as a reader, we sort of wonder, does this thing really work? Is the guy just making it all up? And at the end, the main character, Mr. Cave, dies, and his friend can't find the egg. Apparently, he went through his possessions in his house and tried to find the egg and can't, so it's been lost. But we are getting his description of this alien world bit by bit, and it is just observation. We don't know their economics or their politics or anything like that, so it's basically how we would learn about an alien civilization, without actually immersing ourselves into it. So he almost has first contact protocol if you like Star Trek, and because he's forced to, he has no way to communicate. He can only watch. And so it's little piecemeal. Day after day, they're learning more stuff about this civilization. Like I said, it's something that's been done, with mythical creatures and fairy tales and stuff like that, but not in this not in this fashion. So it is a more scientific approach, I guess, to it. To the best of my knowledge, other authors, modern authors, don't do this as much. Maybe, again, like I said, Star Trek First Contact rules, they might do something similar to this, although they don't have a full plot on it. It's usually, we had our team studying for the past year, and now we're going to visit the planet and see what's going on. Okay, what else do we have? The Invisible Man. Now, I like The Invisible Man because, in my opinion, this is like the world's first actual science fiction story. Actually, Jules Verne did a lot that would be considered science fiction, although he based his more on actual science. Jules Verne stuff could be done in reality. The effects might be different than he predicted in some cases, but Invisible Man, what I like about it is he took about 2 pages to explain his theory on invisibility and how to turn invisible. And while it wouldn't work in the real world, he at least explained it. It's none of this, I wanted to turn invisible, so I studied chemistry until I found a potion that turned me invisible. That's basically what most science fiction stories had been doing. Like I said, Jules Verne is the exception, but his stuff was a little more realistic. Jules Verne was more engineering fiction than science fiction, I guess you could say, because a lot of what he did was engineering. Another thing, H.G. Wells, I think, in my opinion, he introduced the concept of terrorism and/or guerrilla warfare, which had existed, but he described it in detail with The Invisible Man. Griffin eventually decided, I can use my invisibility to control the world, and they won't know it because, and then he goes through and he basically describes terrorist actions. And so the concept of terrorism and/or guerrilla warfare, if you want to look at it that way, it was nothing 100% new. Let's just say, it was never described, though. The idea of sniping and, hiding and taking pot shots at people, assassins had done it for years. But he actually wrote it down, a description of it. And you can actually compare it to modern day terrorism, and it's like, wow, he got in the mind of the modern day terrorist 100 years before they started doing their thing. That was an interesting thing about this, you know. Okay, next, let's the War of the Worlds, 1898. So this is possibly the first actual alien invasion story. Um, Again, we can go back to fairy tales and other things, and yes, we had non-human characters. This is the possibly first ones, or when I say first ones, let's say the ones that made it more popular. I'm not going to claim, haven't read every book that ever existed, so I'm not going to claim H.G. Wells invented all these things, but he greatly popularized most of them. So, and in most cases, so far as I can tell, because I haven't read every book that ever existed, but so far as I can tell, he was the first one to write about him. So he was either an early person who popularized it or the first one in most cases. So bear in mind throughout this video, when I say he's the first, that's what I really mean. But alien invasions, now he did other things. So they had the heat ray. And again, this was 1898 he's writing about this great weapon, the heat ray, which is basically a modern day, or not modern day equivalent would be the laser. But they didn't know about lasers back then. It was 1917 when Einstein first wrote a paper on optics which sort of theorized on the laser. It wasn't until 1957 that a man named Gordon Gould wrote an unpublished paper about him. So Gordon Gould had worked with something called masers, which they were basically matter beams. Subatomic particles, and we can, or even your atomic particles, just very small particles. We can make streams of them and try to do things with them. And so he popularized that concept. And again, in an unpublished paper, he theorized about being able to do this with light. Sometime later, two men, Charles Towne and Arthur Schawlow, I might be mispronouncing that, actually had a published paper dealing with lasers. And in 1960, a man named Theodore Mollman actually made one. So, about 65 years before we're theorizing about lasers, H.G. Wells has the heat ray, which is basically the Victorian era concept of a laser. Later science fiction writers would have ray guns and stuff like that, which were basically a takeoff of the heat ray. He also had the red weeds. Interesting thing about the red weeds I like. So these plants that the Martians brought with them were just spreading throughout England. And at one point, as the narrator's talking about them, at one point he says, I don't know if they did this by accident or seeds just got carried along with them. Or no, if they did it on purpose or seeds just got carried along with them and it was done by accident. But these red plants were taking over. And so in basically one sentence, he describes invasive species and terraforming. So whether it was done on purpose or accident, we had these invasive species which man knew about. We had tried to introduce rabbits to Australia and found out that was a bad idea. So the concept of invasive species, even though it wasn't necessarily called invasive species, was nothing new to us. But at the same time, if they had done it on purpose, which again the narrator said it might have been done on purpose, might have been done on accident, then that would be the Martians trying to terraform Earth, which is, again, best of my knowledge, this would be the earliest example of someone describing terraforming. Anything else? That's all we get. 1899, he wrote When the Sleeper Wakes. I've read this one. he reprinted. Basically, he was in a rush when he first wrote it, and he rewrote one, "The Sleeper Awakes" in 1910. And in some of his notes, some of the notes I found about it, he talks about how he was in a rush when he first wrote it, and so he wanted to rewrite it, but he wasn't in the same state of mind. And so I actually read this story, or this it's actually a book, and thing is, I didn't know that he wrote two versions of it. I didn't know he updated. So I don't know if I actually read the updated one or the original. Um, the one I did read was called "When the Sleeper Awakes," so I assume it's the original. But later editors could have just put that name on the other one. It's hard to tell. So this is the first example of a dystopian future that I've ever come across. So the idea of we're writing about future times and things got really where government went corrupt and you know man's living in this weird society where you're either one of the elite or a drone and all this other stuff. Like this is probably, and I'm assuming that the original had this concept in it. So this was probably the earliest dystopian future written about in a story. And then also they have flying machines, and so um, these flying machines had been written about before. And then people have been trying to fly. People have been trying to invent flying machines. Um, But the concept of using them for warfare, this might be the earliest time. He actually wrote another book, which I did not write down the title of, where maybe 1920s or so he wrote this book where airplanes were used for warfare. Actually, it would have been before the 20s because, and so some people say this was the first, of airplanes being used for warfare. But like I said, back in The Sleeper Awakes or When the Sleeper Wakes, the main character learns to fly an airplane and uses it to save, you know, he eventually starts a revolution and uses it to hold off the bad guys while the other rebels overthrow things, basically. Um, so again, the concept of using air, if that was part of the 1899 version, then that would have been like the earliest idea of aerial warfare, possibly. Um, First Men in the Moon, 1901. Now, jump back in time to 1865. Jules Verne writes From the Earth to the Moon and A Trip Around. Um, so that would be the first, possibly, idea of space travel. The thing is, with Jules Verne, it was a shell. Basically, they dug a giant mortar into the ground, put a hollow shell in it, and they fired it to the moon. It had limited maneuverability. They got to the end of the story. They find they're stuck in orbit around the moon, and they had a means we can either try to land on the moon or we can try to get back to Earth. And they had there was a tube, basically we can do a chemical reaction and it'll push us one direction or the other. And it was a one-shot deal, so it wasn't really, so their spacecraft was still just a projectile, even though they had this one ability, one-shot maneuverability. First Men in the Moon. H.G. Wells comes up with a concept of a spaceship that you can control and move it and determine where it goes. It's not just a projectile. Again, he describes how this would work. Basically, it comes from blocking out gravity, which we can't do, but he wrote a description of how he thought this was possible. So again, it falls more into the science fiction than just the science fantasy, even though it actually wouldn't work in real life. But it was a maneuverable spaceship. He could have gone to the moon. He could have gone to any planet he wanted. He recognized it would take time to get anywhere, so he just did the moon because that was closest. Uh, there were aliens living in the moon. Unlike Jules Verne, he recognized that you couldn't breathe in outer space and stuff like that. So, but they did find a way inside the moon, and that's where they met the Selenite civilization. And in the end, guess what? The Selenites are planning on invading Earth. So again, we go back to the whole alien invasion thing. So again, possibly the first spaceship, first working spaceship, first man-guided spaceship as opposed to projectile in science fiction. Wouldn't surprise me if Jules Verne had influenced his idea to write this, but he definitely did it differently. The Modern Utopia, I never read, 1905. So, what the description I read about this, basically someone made onto an alternate Earth where people had duplicates. And he actually used the phrase alternate history. Like I said, haven't read this one, but from the description I read, this might be the first parallel universe concept written above in literature. And then 1914, World War I, is about to start, or has started already. Don't know when he did this. But he wrote something called The World Set Free, which sounds like something I want to actually go and read. Again, I've only read a synopsis of it. But Wells he was aware of atomic research, and he actually kept up with modern day science of his time. And so he wrote they had basically atomic grenades. So not as strong as atomic bombs, but they were still largely destructive weapons. This was, again, at the very beginning of World War I. So, atomic weapons ended World War II. So he's 20 years, 25 years perhaps ahead of his time with this. He also comes up with the concept of these weapons are so terrible that eventually people just sort of give up on war, or they realize, he almost theorized the Cold War. People are afraid of these, so we don't want to fight, but we want to make sure we stockpile these, and the mutual assured destruction policy. And so, like I said, that's just a synopsis. He wrote about a book a year for almost 50 years, and so I didn't read all of them. Didn't even I was just looking at synopsis of these. He probably has more stuff of interest, but some of them were repeated themes of his earlier stories. So I didn't go into too much detail. I could have listed more books, I'm sure. But I just found it interesting that a lot of what he wrote about are things that either other authors picked up on and they have now become popular, or in some cases actually happened. Like I said, the Cold War and the World Set Free. So that's it. H.G. Wells, interesting guy. Good author. He had some social political theories I disagree with, but his fiction I like, and this is why. So have a nice day. Keep reading.